Hi, and welcome to Axschat. Delighted to have Michael Morris with us today. Michael is the director of the National Disability Institute. We overcome plagues of locusts and acts of God today to bring this video interview to you. With Skype being out and the Pope being in town, this has proved trickier than we thought to set up. But actually, brilliant to have you here, Michael. I'm delighted to interview you about the work that you're doing for the National Disability Institute, and delighted that Deborah managed to persuade you to join us, because I know that Deborah is a long-term collaborator and friend of yours. So can you tell us a little bit about what first brought you into this area of work, and then we can go on to find out a bit more about the work of the NDI.
Yeah, I'd love to, and thank you for giving me this opportunity today. I didn't take perhaps a life path that many people find that bring them into the disability community. I did not become invested in it because I was a parent and had a child with a disability, or I was born with a disability or acquired a disability. My entrance is unusual. More than 35 years ago, I was graduating from law school, receiving my law degree. My colleagues were all interviewing for top law firms in Atlanta, Georgia, where I was located, New York City, all across the country. And I went to the career service office and I said, I don't want to be a lawyer. And they looked at me and they said, what are you doing here? People like you left years ago. A few people carried forward and spent the full 3 years graduating. And they said, we can't help you. So I, at that point, went to looking in newspaper ads, talking to colleagues, and came across an ad in what was then the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the daily newspaper for that city, that said a disability organization was looking for an individual who would work with the state legislature and also help families with, at that time, was a new law that protected a child's right to education. And they wanted someone who could counsel and advocate on behalf of families on a one-to-one basis dealing with their local school systems, where for the first time they really had a right to go to their neighborhood schools and get a quality education and open up equal educational opportunity. So I didn't quite know what to make of that, but I answered the ad. I was even more shocked when I got a response in a few days, and they called me in for an interview. And they talked to me about this opportunity, and I said to them, I don't know the first thing about disability. And they said, that's okay, that we can teach you. What they were really enamored with was I had spent the 3 years in law school working for a member of the state legislature. And so they knew I had those connections. And it's from that they said, well, you could be really helpful to us to get our positions known, our unmet needs known, and sort of begin to really strengthen their advocacy efforts. So I took the job. It was with the Association for Retarded Citizens of Georgia. Today we would talk about it as people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I began about 2 weeks after that interview, and now some 35 years later my career has stretched from that early work with that organization to working on a member of the United States Senate and a subcommittee on disability policy as legal counsel, and working for many different organizations until finally about 10 years ago I started this one, the National Disability Institute. I had worked on all kinds of issues, as all of us are certainly focused on: healthcare and employment and transportation and affordable and accessible housing, and the advent of technology changing people's lives and level the playing field. But what I found underneath and kind of a common chord or strand across all of this, we weren't talking about the underlying issue, which is fundamental, and that is that people with disabilities are living in poverty. In the United States, people with disabilities are almost 3 times more likely to be living in poverty than their non-disabled peers. Around the world, the issue of poverty is certainly synonymous with disability. Disability both causes and is a consequence of finding oneself in poverty, and poverty also causes disability. So it's an interesting focal point and framework. And with National Disability Institute, we have built bridges and lines of communication and changed both policy, thinking, and behavior that, in fact, people with disabilities can escape poverty, that people can be economically empowered, that people can make informed financial decisions, they can learn better to manage their money, and think about really a better economic future. That's what National Disability Institute is about.
Okay. It sounds fantastic, and these are themes that are very close to my own heart. I believe strongly that everything is interconnected, that we need to be dealing with stuff at a macro level. I know that your Twitter handle, the one that NDI uses, goes under the moniker of real economic impact, and I think that absolutely the truth that you speak about the impact of legislation on poverty for people with disabilities is significant. What often is the case is that people don't talk about the cumulative impact of changes to legislation, and I know that that's a hot potato in the UK right now, because there's been lots of changes to legislation in the UK that have affected people with disabilities, and there are calls for cumulative impact assessments due to the effect that it's having. Tell us a bit more about the economic analysis that you're doing and the arguments that you're putting forward here.
Right. Let me put it in a context or a framework. Our very famous worldwide civil rights law was passed 25 years ago, which established the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it was with bipartisan support. People to the left and liberal side of the political spectrum, and people all the way to the conservative and to the right. But there was a general understanding that people with disabilities shouldn't be invisible, they shouldn't be isolated, they shouldn't be segregated. There has to be equality of opportunity. We need to break down barriers related to physical and communication access and programmatic access, so that the quality of life is part of the fabric of every community. Within that law was a statement about the goals for our society. People with disabilities should be to have the opportunity for independent living and full community participation. But there was a third phrase that we spent very little time on over the last 25 years. And that phrase was to also advance economic self-sufficiency. Many people have equated that to say, well, people should be working, and they should be. Most people with disabilities want to work and want to have that opportunity. However, we haven't taken it further. Employment is the means to an end. It's not the end. The end is economic self-sufficiency. So we have spent a great deal of time mining data about people's financial behavior, people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities, banking status, and really getting an economic picture in the macro level that you talk about across the spectrum of disability. And here's some of the things that we've learned and really have created a baseline that up to 2 years ago we didn't have in this country. It's a baseline we really should establish globally to separate where people with disabilities are economically as compared to people without disability. What we learned in this country, shockingly, is that 1 out of every 2 working age adults with disabilities are unbanked. they are not using the traditional banking system. What that does is cost them more money. It means they're not making very informed financial decisions, and actually is perpetuating and exaggerating their status of being living in poverty. What we learned as well is that people with disabilities are using at least twice as often what we call non-traditional financial services to establish and access money for whatever purpose they need. They're using pawn shops. They're using check cashing places. They're using predatory lenders. They're using all the kind of underside of the financial world, which only aggravates their poverty status and has them spending money that does not need to be spent. So our activities have been about helping educate the financial world, helping educate the social and human service delivery systems that are there to support people with disabilities, helping people with disabilities, family members, parents, understand that there is a better way. There is a meaningful pathway. Each person can create their own personal pathway that really builds on, yes, you need to work, but work is just the beginning, and we need to think about savings, financial goals, making positive, very, very appropriate decisions about investment vehicles. All of this is possible. And really on the micro level, it takes us to another point, which is we are the last minority that is not understood completely by the business community, the market sector, the lost business opportunity. People with disabilities are consumers. Parents raising children with disabilities are consumers. We haven't yet moved to where we've moved by gender, by race, by ethnicity, or even people differentiated by sexual orientation, where the business world recognizes that's a market. That's a market.
That's yeah. So you're talking about the purple pound, as it's called in the UK, and it's a huge market. I know that both Antonio and Deborah have got questions, so I'll hand over to Antonio first.
No, I was going to ask about the banking system, but then you mentioned something else about reports. Now we see a lot of companies, providing reports about diversity, but then we only see gender and ethnicity. So there's so many things missing in those reports. But sometimes I see young startups that are in a phase of growth who are putting those reports out there, but when they are talking about gender and ethnicity, they don't mention diversity, not because they don't want to, just because of awareness. So they are a bit naive in the way how they publish those reports. So I found, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I see. What type of, when you talk with people about the importance of diversity, how they react when you say, okay, diversity is not just gender and ethnicity. What type of reactions are you getting from?
Yeah, well, with my good colleague Deborah and others in the United States, we finally have made great strides, really almost just in the last 10 years, where diversity, which is about respect and understanding of the value of people based on individual differences, whether it's the color of your skin or your ethnic background, we finally have reached a point where major corporations, Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies, do understand diversity also includes people with disabilities. Where I don't think people have been able to go yet is understanding two things. That when we talk about disability, you're talking about the ultimate heterogeneous group because of different types of disability. But people with disabilities also have those other characteristics defined by gender, race, and ethnicity, and age. And so people with disabilities are in all of the diversity but I don't think the other groups necessarily think about, well, I'm a woman and disabled, and so let's embrace people with disabilities. I'm a person of color, and I'm disabled, and I'm a woman. Well, some of our research has actually shown, when we've looked at the poverty levels, and this won't surprise you, and it would be in the United States. We haven't studied it around the world, but I'm sure the statistics would hold up globally. And that is, at the bottom of the economic ladder, living in the deepest level of poverty, are people who are not male, so women, are not white, so defined by other races, and are also defined by diversity of ethnicity. And then even within the scope of disability, there is varying degrees of achievement. And so individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, an individual really challenged by profound mental illness and mental health, are at the bottom of the economic ladder. And in fact, I'm not even sure they're on the first rung. We've been able to study the fact that the average household income led by a person with a disability is, now it's going to be high compared to global standards, but in terms of the US, is running about an under $15,000 annual income. The median income in the United States is $52,000 a year for a household. Now, $15,000 may be a lot in Africa or other places, but we are profoundly at the bottom. Now, here's the opportunity for us. There's only one way to go, and that's up. That's increased employment opportunity and increased understanding of participating in the economic mainstream with savings and financial services and investments and things like that.
Michael, $15,000, I don't know how you can live in the United States making $15,000. I don't know how you can have a house and transportation. It seems impossible, especially in some of our cities that are more expensive, like DC and New York and Chicago. And I know that these are major problems, and some of the laws that were put in place in the United States to actually protect people with disabilities sort of backfired and sort of held us back even more. But I also know, just making a couple of statements, that that Americans across the board in the United States are struggling with these financial issues and understanding how economics work. And you know, many of us were totally caught by surprise by the 2008 crash, and but I wonder, you know, what different steps do we need to take? I know that you were very active in passing the ABLE Trust, and is that part of the solution? I mean, tell us more about the solutions.
Sure. When you have a problem as complex as poverty, and poverty has so many dimensions to it, there's no magic single solution. But we've been working very hard on making changes and have had some success. Last year, on December 19th, President Obama signed into law what is called the ABLE Act. ABLE stands for Achieving a Better Life Experience. What it does is offer adults with disabilities, families, parents raising a child with a disability, the opportunity to create a tax-advantaged savings account. They can contribute money in, and then they can take that money out, but it's tax-free. There's no taxes on it. And it is a recognition within ABLE, there's not just one barrier to full community participation and better quality of life. It may be extra costs related to transportation, healthcare, housing, employment, education, or for many people, all of those things. And so ABLE allows you to create this account, save, and then remove that money without being a consequence of our tax system. What that does is also get at the other issue that you mentioned, which is we have many of our laws and public policy that were meant to protect people with disabilities, but in fact really have the opposite impact. They create what is called a ceiling in terms of assets a person with a disability can have.
So I was about to ask about that. Because
Okay.
I'd read a bit about the ABLE Act, and from what I could see, actually people with intellectual disabilities were precluded from having too many assets, which effectively meant that they're not able to participate on an equal footing in society because they weren't allowed to have a higher level of savings. Has the ABLE Act changed that? And
The ABLE Act does change that. So let's back up so that people fully understand the challenge. In order to get Social Security benefit, which is a monthly cash benefit, which is a survival check, which would have you living at a poverty level, at a low poverty level, but it's still survival to pay for food and housing and other things, less than $1,000 a month. The government said, we'll give you that because we recognize you have unmet needs and you're probably unable to work, an old perception and myth. But to do that, we won't let you accumulate any assets of more than $2,000. Can you imagine anyone living without an emergency fund of just limited to $2,000? You know, your car breaks down, or you have a healthcare emergency. Boom, that $2,000 is going to be gone. What ABLE Act did is said, we recognize this, and we will not count your ABLE account in the testing of eligibility and this asset limit. So for the first time, whether it's your Social Security benefit, your health care through Medicaid, you may have a housing assistance subsidy, you might have a food assistance subsidy, all of them had this asset test, this limit of around $2,000. We broke through that. And now ABLE says to what we expect when ABLE accounts are allowed to be open across this country next year, we expect between 5 to 10 million individuals and families to be positively impacted. But now we've offered someone hope. I consider the ABLE account as a down payment on freedom, the true freedom we really thought we were getting with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act 25 years ago. But the ABLE Act is really the next generation of understanding that, one, people with disabilities have extra costs of just living every day in the mainstream, and two, that there is a way now to save money and not necessarily lose a variety of government benefits, which also are part of that social safety net and survival. That's a real major sea change in thinking and what it will impact in terms of behavior of millions of people and families in this country in the next 5 years.
yeah,
It is. It's huge. It's huge. It's huge for
I also read in the Guardian newspaper in the UK that the additional costs to an average family for bringing up a disabled child is about 18% extra in terms of their income, and that's the mean cost. Though it's, yeah, obviously it varies from family to family and from disability to disability, but that's a huge extra financial burden that people are taking on, and that's just during childhood, and people's needs don't change. Well, they may change, but they don't go away as they get older and enter into adulthood. So the need to have that safety net's massively important, and I'm privileged enough to live in a country that has free healthcare and so on. Yeah. When I think about the precariousness with which people must have been living with that level of savings in a country where, until Obamacare came along, there just wasn't that luxury, it's quite scary.
Well, and you take this position until the ABLE Act was passed last year. A person really had to think about, well, people are saying I should work, but if I work and then I can't put the money in savings because maybe I want to buy a house someday, or maybe I want to gain access to an accessible van that I may gain new mobility and freedom. They basically made the choice, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. And so they didn't work. ABLE changes that type of thinking dramatically. And so I think what's amazing to me is the U.S. is the second country to create an ABLE-type tax advantage savings account. There is something similar that predates it in Canada. But I do not believe there's another country anywhere in the world that has recognized this extra cost of disability and not created this bargain that the government will help you, but you have to remain poor. The new bargain is the government will help you because it recognizes you have extra costs that impact your life every day. And we want to incentivize you to put money aside, so whether it's an emergency or it's a long-term asset that you're trying to acquire, a car, a house, start a business, whatever it is now you have some real choices, some quality of life choices we had never seen before. Now, this piece of legislation took 9 years to get through the United States Congress, but when it passed with overwhelming support from the most conservative members to the most liberal members, because I think this is about finally families, adults with disabilities, getting this message across to our decision makers, our thought leaders, that, you know, people with disabilities are more visible than ever. But in addition to being visible, they want to be a part of the economic mainstream. They want to have access to responsive and affordable financial products and services. They want to be able to invest like others. They want to take their income production and have a plan for a better economic future. That's what we try to do at the National Disability Institute.
And
Powerful stuff.
It's very interesting, and it's absolutely the right message. Just to back up what you're saying, in the UK, 40% of disabled children are living in poverty, and a third of disabled adults. So it's, despite there being some kinds of safety net, they're not great, and those kind of safety nets are to basically keep you alive, not to give you a decent standard of living.
No, and they're also part of the digital divide, and they end up paying more for services than other people.
Exactly, and those are the points you were making earlier about the non-traditional banking methods, the predatory lending, and everything else. So I think what you're doing by focusing on giving people financial independence is laudable and really, really important. So what are the things that the NDI are doing to help people with the process of gaining that independence? Okay, it's being enacted by law, but there are obviously other things that people need to do, other things that organizations need to do to build upon that and to enable people to actually access these accounts.
Yes, as I said, the law was just signed this past December, and this year, 2015, we have been working with states all across the country to build their infrastructure so that the opportunity to open accounts will start next year. Unfortunately, with this legislation, it required our states to pass that legislation that said they will establish ABLE accounts and an ABLE account program. The good news is 31 of 50 states actually, since January of this year, moved through their state legislation, passed it, was signed by their governor, and they're on their way. But it means the other approximate 20 states, people in those states are still working hard before they'll see the day when ABLE accounts will be a possibility for them. But here's something that we're doing at NDI that is both for the ABLE account system that will happen in the future, but for people with disabilities in general and families across the country. We've created a variety of programs around financial education. We're testing different programs in terms of one-on-one coaching, mix of supports through different strategies, working with a variety of community partners. We're working with banks, we're working with credit unions, we're working with public agencies, and we're working with community nonprofits, both in the disability sector and then more broadly just as part of the fabric of any local community. I will tell you that, and Deborah made the point, when you think about how much any of us know and how challenging it is, given the complexity of the financial world, is how to make that right decision. Where should I put my money? Is there a difference between this banking institution and another one? Should I go to a credit union versus a bank? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? What type of lending product should I be thinking about? How do I improve my credit? How do I reduce my debt? So we're working on these issues, and I think people with and without disabilities are challenged. But for people with disabilities, again, two things come into play. One is the complexity of our government system, which they're a part of. And now with ABLE, we can get past that asset test that limited where they could put or keep money for savings. But the other part of it is really about thinking about a future that I think before ABLE, I think people were really compromised, really diminished in their expectations. I know before our ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, people would say that, gosh, there was no protections against discrimination. And over the 25 years, a lot of barriers have crumbled, have fallen. But this economic empowerment issue, it's beyond civil rights. And I know I've studied the history of other civil rights movements, whether it's people based on the color of their skin, or it's women and it's gender, is what you'll see often is it was first about civil rights, but then you have to move eventually to, so people don't discriminate against you, but more than that is, what am I doing for myself? Because it's not just government with a handout, but what is our responsibility as individuals with disabilities, as family members, as parents, to set out an expectation around maximizing education, maximizing opportunity in terms of employment, and then really looking at career pathways and looking at being of a financial status that provides economic security and mobility. That's a new wave. That's not what we're doing now. Now we applaud and congratulate people. You got a job. And now you're working at minimum wage and maybe 20 hours a week. Well, that's exciting. I don't want to diminish that, because that beats the old way of people sitting at home or in a sheltered workshop where they earn pennies a week or a few dollars a week. But we've got to raise our expectations. We've got to change our way of thinking and behavior. That's by the policymakers, that's by families, that's by individuals with disabilities, is when you're truly a part of the economic mainstream, you're valued. People have to look beyond the civil rights, and that's the next 20 years. This won't happen overnight. That's where companies begin to recognize, where I mentioned before, people with disabilities are a market sector because they have purchasing power. They buy things. They buy all types of products. Then people begin to recognize and value you. That's economic empowerment.
Deborah, I have a question.
Yeah, Michael, I'm curious how it works with the employee. And sorry, I'm getting really bad. So I'm going to take mistake. So the thing that is interesting as an employer is there were multiple times when I hired people with disabilities and they were limited to what I could actually pay them. They were worth, let's say $100,000 on the marketplace because of the skills they brought to the table, but they actually, I could not pay them that. They were limited to what I could pay them. I have an employee right now that has cerebral palsy, and she's limited to what I can pay her. It's ridiculous. And so I try to be creative, but I cannot pay this woman that is talented. If she didn't have a disability, I could pay her $100,000, but because she does have a disability, what I'm allowed to pay her is ridiculous. Does the ABLE Act sort of help with some of those issues?
Right. So maybe for some people who might not completely understand what you just said, they might be thinking, well, what's holding them back from earning more, and what's holding you back as the employer from not paying them more? And the answer comes back to these really perverse, old public policies which said that for me to get health care, for me to get this Social Security benefit and monthly check, but mostly health care, it set a ceiling on what assets you could have. ABLE is going to get you past that. And ABLE is going to create a new set of calculations for you as an employer and for that employee and for lots of job seekers or people with disabilities who need to now go out and be seeking jobs because we lifted the ceiling. We took away the glass ceiling, and in our case it wasn't glass. It might have been, rocks, brick. There was no breaking through it because the choice left you with, there's no way I could afford to lose my health care and lose some of these other social public benefits. We've now changed it. And so what's exciting for us, National Disability Institute, once these accounts are open, we'll be studying the impact on individuals, the impact on families, and generally for an employer, what you just said to me, one of our nation's largest employers, when I explained ABLE to him, he said to me, this is amazing, because they hire thousands of people with disabilities, very large Fortune 100 company, but every person they hired has said, I don't want to work more than 20 hours or 25 hours because of whatever their wages are, and where that might take them to lose some of the social safety net, whether it's Social Security, healthcare, or other things. ABLE changes that calculation, and it's going to be exciting to study and show people. The early ABLE account owners will be the trailblazers, will be the pioneers. Lots of people are risk adverse. I mean, we could explain ABLE over and over again, and they would say, maybe rightfully so, I don't believe, that's impossible, that's too good to be true. We need those early pioneers will show us that new pathway. And then I think we're going to see geometrically an increase in number of people saying, wow, it's true, we can do this. We can make more money. And we can now put money aside in our account. And then one better is we're not even going to be able to have to pay taxes on it, because there's a recognition we have extra costs that my neighbor or my friend doesn't have. And this will help me cover those costs to level the playing field. That's extraordinary. We have had inquiries about ABLE from countries around the world, Ireland and England and countries as far away as Australia, because this represents a new approach of government that really takes us into where we are in the 21st century. People with disabilities can work. Technology gave them new power. You've done that so much to access the internet, to have the tools to be effective in so many types of jobs. But now we have this last potential piece of the puzzle where I shouldn't have to give up all my government benefits. If I need some of them, I should have the ability to put some of my money aside for emergencies, rainy day fund, or some big goals that I have in my life.
I'm so proud of you, Michael. I'm so proud of you, Michael.
You just mentioned the country that I'm in. I'm in Ireland. There's been a huge debate about the rights of people with disabilities. That is actually at the moment on the table.
Yes, and there are folks working with Gerard Quinn at the National University who have been following. They've been following ABLE with me for years. And every year I'd have to say, they would check in and say, so did you pass it this year? And I would say, no, not yet. We're getting closer. But finally, we got across the board. And this is interesting, too, because this is about what Deborah represents as a parent with a lovely daughter with one way of characterizing her is as someone with a disability. There are lots of other ways we could talk about her daughter, is how this legislation got passed wasn't big money interests, which is the way most legislation and public policy changes. These were families meeting one-on-one, day after day, week after week, with their members of Congress, their elected officials. And little by little, from across this country, the opinions changed. And what sold them was the personal story about costs that are overwhelming for families. So parents did this really, probably even more so than working age adults. But it's parents with a vision like Deborah has always had for her daughter, is I don't want her sitting at home. I know people with significant disabilities can work. They can add value with their talent to all kinds of jobs, all kinds of industries. And so it was that story that worked. Now, it took a long time. It took over 8 years. But we do think
we did it.
we did it, and we do think it will change the life course. It will change expectations for the family who today finds out that they have a child born with Down syndrome will have a different pathway than you did so over 20 years ago.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much. We have to wrap up at the end of our half hour now. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much. Great to be able to talk with you.
Thank you, Michael.